Hello everyone, welcome to this evidence-based mental health hangout on mHealth for mental health. My name is Andrea Tomlin and some of you may know me as the mental health. It's a bit of a cliche, people always say this when they're sharing these things, but I am genuinely delighted to be chairing this discussion on digital mental health today. We've got a fabulous group of people on our experts panel. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a minute. But first of all, I'm going to give a quick overview of how the next hour is going to fly by for you. We couldn't have a digital mental health hangout without inviting people to join via Twitter. So we're doing that, as always, via the EBMH chat hashtag. So if you're watching this live stream, please do tweet us your comments and questions to EBMH chat. Holly is running the EB Mental Health Twitter account today, and she'll relay any information to us. So hopefully we can include your questions in the discussion. So it's estimated that 1 in 10 people with mental health problems in England have to wait over a year for treatment. So it seems kind of logical that apps can help cut the queues, or at least provide some support for people whilst they're waiting. But of course, digital mental health is much more than that. The field has started to come of age in recent years, and we now have a wide range of mature and scalable products and services that are targeted at people experiencing mental illness and promoting mental well-being. Before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to make a quick point about terminology. There's lots of jargon in this discussion, and we want to make it as open and accessible as possible. So do tweet us if you're watching and we say something that you don't understand. mHealth itself obviously is key jargon. That's just an abbreviation for mobile health, and that's a term that's used for the practice of medicine and public health, which is supported by mobile devices. I personally prefer digital mental health. It's a slightly broader term, which includes mobile and other digital technologies, websites. It's a bit more accessible, I think. If you want an introduction to the field, there was a really good report written by the NHS Confederation a couple of years ago now, still very relevant. It's called The Future's Digital, Mental Health and Technology, and I think Holly's tweeting a link to that right now, so you can have a look at that free PDF on the web. So our discussion is going to begin with a short presentation from Lisa Marzano, who's recently published a great personal view in the Lancet Psychiatry called The Application of mHealth to Mental Health, Opportunities and Challenges. Then we're going to have a group chat. I'm going to cover 3 main topics. The first is just to give some examples of our favourite digital mental health products and services and innovations. So while we're doing that, please do tweet some examples of your own favourite products so we can get a sense of what there is out there. We're then going to talk about risks and regulation, which I hope will cover some of the recent developments with NICE and what they've got planned. And then we're going to finally cover key challenges for designers and developers, so what it is that we need to be doing to produce better products in this field. So let's introduce our expert panel now. I'm joined by my colleagues Andrea, Cipriani and Holly Millward from Evidence-Based Mental Health. They've been the driving force of these EBMH chats over the recent months. And it's important to say we've had apologies from 2 people this morning. 2 of our speakers can't make it because they're not well. That's Alicia Ridout and Leah Ali. So get well soon, Alicia and Leah, if you're watching. Perhaps you can send us some words of wisdom via some tweets in the next hour or so. The joys of 24/7 connectivity. You can still join in the discussion even if you're in your sick bed. So I'm not going to do a formal round of introductions. I'm going to ask people to introduce themselves. So Lisa, over to you first. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Lisa Marzano. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at Middlesex, and my background is very much in suicide and self-harm research, but more recently I've been thinking about the ways in which digital technologies can feed into this, both in terms of research and clinical practice.
Great, thank you. So you're a recent convert to kind of mHealth. We'll talk a bit about that in your presentation. Great. Okay, so James, over to you.
So I'm James Woollard. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and also a senior clinical fellow in mental health technology at NHS England. So I have a clinical role and I work with young people and use technology or have experimented with technology in that space, using Minecraft in therapy or in therapeutic settings. And I've also, I suppose my role in NHS England is looking at coordinating national mental health policy with technology policy and trying to bring those two juggernauts together.
Great, thanks very much. In a head-on collision. Mark, over to you.
Hello, my name's Mark Brown. If you're on Twitter, you might know me as Mark1in4. I do lots and lots of mental health stuff. I experienced mental health difficulties myself, which is what led me to be doing mental health stuff. And over the past 2 to 3 years, what I found myself doing is increasing amounts of digital stuff, mainly because I think digital is probably one of the areas where we're going to have the biggest chance to do new things or to sweat the assets of the things we already have.
Fantastic, thank you. Caroline, do you introduce yourself for us, please?
Yes, I'm Caroline Fines. I run an organisation called Giving Evidence. We work across charitable activity and charitable giving and work on getting there to be better use of evidence by charities in deciding what services to run and by donors and funders in deciding what to support. And so we work in many sectors and have recently been doing a study looking at the UK charities in the UK mental health arena and looking at what evidence and research they produce, what they disseminate and how, and what they use. So quite a broad study across the mental health space.
Thank you. And I had to include the book plug for you, not because you asked me to, but just because it's a brilliant title. I thought it ain't what you give, it's the way that you give it. Is that right?
Correct, that's true.
It's very hard to say that
that's
without.
True.
I found myself starting to sing it. So is that because you were a Fat Boy 3 fan in the early 80s, or was there?
I can't possibly comment.
Okay, good. And Andres, over to you finally.
Hi, I'm Andrea Fonseca. I'm a consultant psychiatrist by training, dual qualified in adult and old age psychiatry. I'm honorary lecturer at Roehampton University and University College London. And what I do most of the day is I run a company that develops mental health apps called Thrive. So yeah, that's me.
Great. Thanks for joining us, everyone. So that's fantastic. We've got a great panel. We've got 52 minutes left. So over to you, Lisa, with your presentation.
Hang on, I'll switch to PowerPoint, I hope. Yeah. There we go. Hopefully you can all see this now.
Yes, that's coming up.
Right. Yes, and I mean, as you said, the idea was just to give an introduction, I suppose, to the area by talking about some of the work that we've been doing recently in the field, and linked very much to this paper in the Lancet Psychiatry and this viewpoint. But I guess rather than give the sort of standard, academic, here's the background to the research, I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about what the backstory was. And the backstory is that I have been working for a number of years now in suicide and self-harm research, been involved in various studies where we've used sort of fairly conventional methods, interviewed people in a one-to-one situation, whether that's using more sort of structured tools, clinical tools sometimes like the Mini, or sometimes using sort of more open-ended, qualitative type methods. But either way, very much in a situation where we're sort of one-to-one with somebody, asking them to recall information that they might have difficulty recalling, or that sometimes that they find uncomfortable recalling, if not distressing. So the idea really started with, what happens if we'd allow people to sort of tell their story in their own time, in their own space. And I guess there is a tradition of sort of doing kind of diary research in psychology and medicine and many other areas. But what I was particularly interested in was the possibilities that sort of new technologies could offer for that. So the project really started with, you sort of look around you, there's, mobile phones absolutely everywhere almost. And it started as an idea of, we could ask people to keep video diaries and tell us their story and understand more about the sort of phenomenology of a particular problem. And then, you know, as the technology developed and as we thought about it more, we thought actually there is so much more that we could do with technology to understand the sort of microprocesses and the mechanisms by which that might be triggering particular issues, or that might be reinforcing them at the same time. You know? And so we sort of, having started just with video diaries, before you knew it, we ended up with a sort of slightly more complex scheme, which had various elements, and one of them was we sort of used a standard chest strap, and we were quite interested in looking at the feasibility of gathering real-time heart rate and heart rate variability data. So my colleagues in computer science developed this sort of bespoke box that you can see that would sort of timestamp every heartbeat when the person was wearing the chest strap.
Sorry, Lisa, can I interrupt just for a second? We can't see that chest strap. Well, I can't, at least. I don't know if other people on the
can you not? Can you see?
We're still on your first slide. I think there's some problems with the way Lisa's presenting, Holly. Is it possible that you could bring up the slides instead and take us through them?
I think the easiest thing to do, Lisa, is if you shrink down your notes on your PowerPoint presentation, and then so the slides are big, and that's probably the easiest way to present them.
Okay, thanks.
Like this.
Perfect.
That's better.
Okay, so hang on, going back. So you were stuck on my first slide. Did you see this? No. Never mind.
I didn't, no. No, I just saw the first one.
That's fine. You were listening to what I was saying. My lovely image. You missed it. Never mind.
Carry on from where you were, though. That's great. You can see the heart monitor slides now.
So here's the chest strap. And then what we also did was we asked people to use a jawbone up. It's quite similar. I mean, I think a lot of people now use a Fitbit instead, and what it does is it sort of allows monitoring of sort of sleep, both sleep quality and sleep duration, as well as activity. So it sort of gives a breakdown, you know, hour by hour of how active, how many steps people are taking. And I guess why it was important for us, because we thought this might, you know, gives us information about things that we know might potentially be important. You know, that, you know, how active or how sedentary people are has been linked to depression and low mood. And at the same time, we sort of developed an app that was linked to this technology called Insight, and it was designed very much to be a sort of multimedia digital diary. And sort of people were prompted twice a day, and they could decide when, but they could very much decide to ignore those prompts, and also write extra diaries when they wanted to. And what the app did was ask people various questions about how they were feeling at a particular time and how their day was going. And it would ask about sort of particular events that were, you know, potentially meaningful, such as, I don't know, having involved in an argument, or having been binge drinking, etc. And then crucially for the context of the research, it asked whether they'd self-harmed or considered self-harming since their last diary entry. And if the answer was yes, then there would be some sort of follow-up questions asking about the context of that, you know, who were they with, what had happened, did they experience any pain, and importantly, what had happened afterwards as well. And this was very much supported as sort of closed questions, but also free text entries, with people being encouraged to sort of write their my diary, if you want, where they would be reflecting on their sort of day, but also to talk about their wider story if they decided to share that. And along the way, they had the option to add photos, video, and audio, because we were conscious that not everybody prefers to express themselves using text or writing, and some people might want to, going back to the original idea, which was to do video diaries, some people might want to sort of use other ways of telling their story. And the app was also linked to a WordPress blog, so they could access their diary via tablets and PCs, etc., etc. And at the same time, the app was recording location data, GPS data, which again would give us a sense of whether there were particular sort of trigger locations, how far people were traveling, etc. So, as a feasibility study, we run it with sort of 5 men. We had the support of this charity that supports people with personality disorders. We had sort of quite a small number of participants, but actually one of the important lessons we learnt was that it was possible to gather quite a lot of data, in fact, probably more than I thought we would. Overall we had 230 My Diary entries, which meant that all the participants made at least one entry on most days. And I should add, participants were asked to participate for 3 weeks, to keep this diary for 3 weeks. 2 of them actually volunteered to stay in the study longer. Others also contributed to sort of my story entries. Mostly were text-based, but there were also some video diaries, some photos, and some audio diaries as well. And we eventually gathered information about 92 episodes involving thoughts of self-harm, 21 incidents of actual self-harm, as well as a lot of data in relation to sleep, activity, and heart rate. And inevitably, the data is going to be messier than what would be collected in the lab. And we have got stories of missing data. We have one case of a dog literally chewing the box that goes with the chest strap, so and literally eating my homework. It's been unfortunate. We lost a lot of data there. But I guess what we learned from the study was that it is possible to gather quite a lot of information in real time from people experiencing mental health problems. And what we also learned was that it was possible to not just gather these data, but integrate them and start to analyze them in meaningful ways. So we've started thinking of visualizations to sort of map this data across time and see how various variables might be changing over time, both independently and in relation to each other. And in ways where we could sort of zoom into particular episodes, so we could have a sort of overview of what was happening to a given participant over the duration of the study, but zoom into times that might have been significant. So the slide I'm showing now is in relation to a time when a participant reported having self-harmed, and we were looking at changes in heart rate and heart rate variability around that time, whilst controlling for that black line, which is basically their movement. Just as importantly, I'd say, what we learned was that, yes, we can gather data, we can integrate it, analysing it is certainly challenging, but it's possible. But perhaps what was most interesting to me, at least, was the reaction that we had, and we can't say too much based on sort of 5 participants taking part in the study, but the response we had and the feedback we had, not just from them, but from the service that helped with the research, was very positive. They all talked about the research having been sort of useful and beneficial and not having had any sort of adverse impact, if you want. And people talked about the diaries especially as being an opportunity for release. So some talked about being able to sort of vent their frustrations and how useful it was to be able to do it even when they were surrounded by other people. They might be, to other people it might look like they were texting or they were on Facebook, and actually they were sort of sharing some of their experiences. Others talked about the whole process of being part of the research, something that had helped them sort of start to identify some patterns, something that in one case in particular had helped him communicate with his therapist. There was one guy who took part who started showing his video diary to the therapist, having previously told me that he found it quite difficult in a one-to-one situation to show him what he was actually like when he felt really down. And others talked more about the sort of health aspects of it, saying how, they like the jawbone up because it helped them with their sleep and with their eating, etc., etc. And so, we had a question about whether there is a potential therapeutic effect and whether that's what John Torres talks about as the kind of digital placebo effect, but it did seem to have an impact. And so much so that, we quite quickly realised that perhaps what we thought about as a research tool was actually potentially more of an intervention, and with potential as an adjunctive therapeutic tool, if you want, both in terms of helping us to monitor symptoms that might be relevant for a particular individual, to increase user and/or clinical insight, and perhaps to help identify symptom trajectories and personalised relapse signatures. At the same time, we thought that this technology could be something quite useful for sort of functional chain analysis to sort of understand maladaptive behaviours and cognitive processes, so to really try and break down, what's happening before, what the functions of particular behaviour might be, and what's happening afterwards, and how that might be reinforcing it. And just as importantly, that these, in this sense, new technologies, and I'm talking particularly about, the work that we've been doing, but it certainly applies to lots of other examples, which we'll discuss later, is that there is great potential to inform and partly deliver timely feedback timely and tailored feedback and intervention. So, you know, there is potential both to sort of help us understand when somebody might be about to sort of hit a crisis, but also to help them when the crisis happens. So whether that takes the form of behavioral activation exercises or mindfulness-based exercises or video consultation or appointment reminders or virtual reality, but there is a lot of potential for the technology itself to become a tool to deliver this therapy. But there are, you know, I mean, obviously a lot of exciting opportunities, and there is a lot of excitement in this area around these opportunities. But at the same time, I think we need to be conscious of what some of the challenges are. And in the context, we know, with so many apps on the market that actually aren't particularly regulated, particularly, and in the absence of you know, quite a strong evidence base about the safety, there are obvious concerns about how safe it is to use this technology, and how safe not just the technology themselves are, but how safe and how can we make sure that we use them in a safe way. You know, it's all very well monitoring somebody's mood in very precise ways and sort of having the right algorithms to detect if somebody and predict whether somebody might be in crisis. But if there's nobody at the other end of this who can actually act on that information, then the system becomes potentially quite dangerous. And of course, there are always, in this area, in relation to anything digital, I guess, there are concerns about this data being, you know, held securely, and how is it being stored, and privacy, and questions around engagement, you know, and whether, you know, it's all very well designing great services and great apps, etc., but we need to make sure that users, and by which I mean patients and clinicians, want to use them, and questions about how effective they are, and how do we even define what's effective in this field, and how cost effective they are, and whether there is a risk. And these are the questions I raised because I know we're going to have a sort of broader discussion about some of these points later, whether there is a risk of becoming over-reliant on self-management, and if these technologies are used in particular ways. As a researcher, I'm afraid perhaps a little bit cliche to end saying that we need more research in this area, but I do think we do, and we need to perhaps coordinate our efforts a little bit better to think about, you know, there is so much more that I think we need to know about how to use these technologies in safe, empowering and effective ways, and then perhaps we need to start sort of thinking about priorities in this area as well as the challenges. And I guess I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial in raising that, you know, ideally, you know, this is work that has to be done in a multidisciplinary context. I mean, you know, as a psychologist, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without colleagues with expertise in other areas. But also that it has to be very much work that's sort of co-designed and co-constructed with users. And again, users are not just people who might be using these who have got mental health difficulties, with clinicians working with them. And when talking about research, inevitably, you know, there are problems, and I think we'll discuss these a bit further in a minute, about how do we then evaluate these rapidly evolving technology, particularly because, you know, if we want to these evaluations to be sort of academically rigorous, academia is not known to be particularly rapid, I'm afraid. And that creates a challenge, as well as sort of design and research design methodological lines. And I think, as a final point, what's not helping perhaps is that there isn't a clear ethical framework or guidelines to direct people working in this field. And I think what can happen with that is that there is a risk, on the one hand, that we are doing something that might not be safe and might have some sort of cause distress, etc. But also there is a risk that, in the absence of sort of agreement about how to conduct research in this field and how to use these technologies, ethics committees become a little bit too risk averse, and potentially that can create a mismatch between what's actually happening in practice, what developers are developing, and what academics are able to actually evaluate. So I'll stop there, but before I do, I just want to, having said about multidisciplinarity, I just wanted to flash a picture of all the people who've worked on this, who are working on with this on me, and some other acknowledgements. And then I think find a way to come back to the screen as me.
Well done, fantastic. Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a really comprehensive presentation, I thought, and covering so many of the issues that we're going to be picking up in the conversation over the next 40 minutes or so. I think really nice to see the kind of story of your project and your passion for the subject area. Coming at this from a kind of psychologist's perspective, but starting to experiment and starting to learn a lot about the field. So I guess people are going to have questions about that, but people are going to have their own kind of projects and experiences to present. So I wanted to just kind of open it up to the floor and to ask other people who've developed products or have got favourite products in mental health in the digital arena to just kind of talk about them for a few minutes. Who would like to kick off with that?
There was silence. Shall I kick off?
Yeah, go for it, Mark.
Go on, Mark.
Yeah, sort of. I over the past couple of years, as I was saying in my introduction, I've done sort of a fair amount of stuff in digital and mental health. My entrance into this world of digital and mental health was being involved in the development of Doc Ready, which came out of a sort of innovation lab process. So it was an idea that started with young people who experience mental health difficulties and difficulties with their well-being, and it's a really, really simple web app. The address is docready.org, and all that does is it helps young people to get ready for their first ever visit to the GP to talk about their mental health, which is really interesting for me because it kind of very much sort of framed my understanding of what we should be doing in relation to mental health and technology, because I think there's a really, really interesting challenge or tension between the solving of service problems and the solving of user problems. If we're very lucky, the problem that a service has is the same problem that its users have, and the service and the user understands the problem in the same way. In practice, in reality, often that's not the case. So the idea of an app that would help young people to get ready to visit the GP would not be an idea that came from GPs. It came from direct experience with young people, because GPs would say, well, obviously we're really good once they get here, not seeing that there's actually a kind of survivorship bias there, and a lot of people who potentially would be helped by visiting the GP won't get there in the first place. So it's kind of starting with user needs for me is really interesting, and it's something we're still not quite as good at. And a lot of my other work in digital is really about that kind of user discovery stuff, so spending time with people, hanging out with people, trying to understand what problems they have, and then to formulate those problems into a shape where we might actually do something about them. So that's kind of where I'm coming at from this. Is that all right for an introduction?
Absolutely. So starting with user problems, that's just fundamental, isn't it, to this field? And I guess there's projects that are inspired by user problems but conducted by researchers, and there's ones that are started by clinicians, and ones that are started by developers, and ones that are actually built by service users themselves. And this kind of idea of co-production, bringing those all together. But what can you say about that kind of fundamental starting with user problems from all those different perspectives? Is it always the same the way we do that, or does it need to be a different approach that we take depending on who's leading?
I think there's sort of three elements. There's presenting problems, which is kind of uncovering them or surfacing them. So you can see that as kind of going into a great big field and then starting to dig until you hit a bit of treasure. But then there's also the question of constraints and tolerances. So the way in which a particular group of users or actors will understand the problem depends very often on their constraints, which is what they see as possible in the context of what they do. So when you're working with professionals, what you need to understand is how much they feel it's possible or desirable to change the flow of their work, and also the meaning of their engagement with their patients. People have different constraints. They may like to do things at a desktop computer and not like to do things on a phone. They may like something this way, they may not like it that way. The third thing is tolerances, is the fact that if you're looking to introduce something that really has a transformative possibility that's digital, some people will not accept that. And also in the context of doing stuff with the NHS, the NHS often isn't really set up for a huge amount of change in the way it does things, and digital tends, when it gets things really right, to be kind of fairly disruptive to the way that we've done things previously. I don't know when the last time you went to a bookshop was, versus the last time you bought a book online, for instance. So even if someone isn't using a digital service, it tends to change the context of the services around it. I think they're the sort of the three things: kind of understanding people, their desires, but also the context and the landscape that they're in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's great. So, Andreas, you were nodding a lot throughout. Do you want to comment on that or add to it?
Yeah, no. So, what's interesting to me is that we basically started. I'm a clinician, obviously, so we started with what we normally do. And then we try to translate that into a digital format. So, we looked at the evidence base, we see what other people have done, and try to incorporate those learnings into developing something new. And, we started about 3 years ago. And what we've been doing since then is exactly what Mark is saying. So, getting nearer and nearer to the user experience. We're very fortunate because one of my co-founders has been in games development all his life. So, his understanding of user interface and user experience has been very valuable. But, a lot of our assumptions that we had initially were challenged by our users. And, basically, I could say that they've shaped the product. Well, basically, it's unrecognizable from our original designs. But it's much more usable and much more, people enjoy it more. So, I think for us, we know that some of these things work, but if you cannot get people to like them, use them frequently, they're not going to do anyone any good. So, I was nodding along because I was agreeing with everything he was saying. I think is fundamental. And also, just to echo what Mark was saying about the NHS and its acceptance to change, from a developer point of view, and maybe that echoes the discussion later on about Buddy App and what happened there. Trying to interface with the NHS when you're a small company is very hard, and that's difficult for me because I train in the NHS, obviously. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Just to say, Andres, your microphone is a little bit quiet. So it's
okay.
Slightly quieter than others, if you can.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great. Right. Thank you.
Andrea, can I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So this question to Lisa, which is about, might sound a bit strange, but it's about data accuracy. I wonder, and I'm not a clinician, and I know you all are, so I'm sure everybody asks this question, which is, I'm wondering how confident one can be that the record that someone gives about when they are experiencing suicidal thoughts or considering self-harm is actually how good a reflection that is of really what's going on.
How good is it? So I think the challenge, we face that same challenge in clinical practice. So when we see someone face to face and we ask them about their symptoms and we ask them about what's been happening over the past couple of weeks, they tell us something. And I suppose that goes to what we were hearing before in the presentation, that perhaps a more real-time data collection might give us more accuracy. But I don't know. I mean, that's the answer. The answer is that the data that we seem to capture when we design experiments well, when we design data collection systems well, seems to be reliable enough. Of course, it can be improved. Yeah.
James, do you want to come in now and tell us a bit about your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about so the kind of experimental or kind of trial I did with a young person with Minecraft, and just thinking about this idea of co-production. And I think, you're thinking about what's the most exciting product out there. Well, actually, I think Minecraft for me is actually probably one of the most exciting products out there, because it wasn't designed to do anything particularly other than to give people something to enjoy, something for people to kind of take away the boredom, to do something a bit creative, and therefore it's a very plastic space. It's a very moldable space that you can use for many different purposes. So you can use it to design for therapeutic service, for therapeutic kind of interventions where you get the young person to say, build me a house that shows me something about you. Build me something in Minecraft that tells me something about you. And my experience is that actually that really puts the emphasis back on them. It's not about me being an expert in anything in particular. They're much more au fait, young people, in using Minecraft than I am. But then you can do much more, you can do much more interesting things, like how about building a model of your inpatient unit on Minecraft so that when you're talking to somebody about going into hospital, they can explore that experience through Minecraft as a relatable kind of interface to their experience. And I'm talking particularly perhaps about young people going into special hospitals, child and adolescent mental health hospitals. So, for me, that's about taking an everyday technology and just using your imagination to use it in a kind of co-producing kind of different way. And I think there's a danger that we think everything has to be specially designed for health, or particularly for mental health. And actually, it's about using your imagination to see how you can use things differently.
And there's something really fundamental about going where it's happening already, rather than trying to build something new. I think that's the same with conversations, isn't it? The reason that Twitter and Facebook are such great places to go and engage with a really democratic group of people is that that's where the conversations are happening already. So building a discussion forum and saying to people, would you like to come and have a discussion here, is rarely the right answer. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. So I guess before we move on to the risks and regulation part of the discussion, I wanted to just ask about barriers, because it's something that comes up every time there's a digital mental health discussion. What are the barriers to uptake? Are people excluded from this, either because they don't have the internet, because they don't have devices? Is that still an issue, do people think?
Every time this comes up, I always think it is an issue, but it's not an issue that's going to be solved by building better apps or doing the things that we're doing. There's kind of very, very real sort of structural and other reasons why people don't have access to technology, and we need to actually address that as a particular thing. What often happens, I find, is people will raise the issue of lack of access, of lack of digital literacy, but if you put them on the spot, they actually have no interest at all in solving that problem. What they actually mean is, I don't like the digital things you're developing. It's used as a kind of trump card. It's always like, well, what about the people who don't have the internet? And you go, well, they won't be using this because they don't have the internet, but that doesn't mean that other people don't have the internet as well. People do have the internet. So you kind of get a sort of silencing of the discussion when people think they pulled this massive, wonderful rhetorical trick and go, but what about the people who don't have the internet? And you go, well, what about the people who do?
Nice, thank you, Mark. Okay, let's move on.
Surely it's a segmentation thing, in that the Minecraft example, and surely there are some bits of electronic delivery or online delivery, mobile delivery, which are superior for some segments, and that's great for those. Nobody is purporting to only be offering one service.
Yes, absolutely. So we need to find the right technology to reach the audience that we're developing it for.
Yeah, just to build on that a little bit. So what you try to do is to make it available as many platforms as you can reach, including web. Most people do have access to some kind of a web browser. So for us, that's been part of our learning, to try and make it available where people are, and building it in a way that is accessible. Even when, of course, Mark is right. There will be people that don't have access to the internet, and they do use it as a trump card. But I think again, from a developer point of view, is to try and build it for as many platforms as you can, possibly, with the resources that you have, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
I sometimes wonder whether the problem in terms of digital divide is not so much at the end, or not only at the end of people who are using these technologies as the patient's clients, but it's actually at the NHS end, and what they can or can't integrate into their services.
Oh, that's a good point.
Very well having, great systems and apps and all sorts of things, but if the NHS platforms are not communicating with them and interoperability, then it becomes quite an issue.
Definitely. We've certainly found the most challenging people to get on these Hangouts, the ones from NHS networks. Yeah, flaky Wi-Fi, firewalls. Okay, let's talk about risks and regulation then, because I think that there was a big story last year. There was an article published in Evidence-Based Mental Health. We blogged about it on the Mental Health, which showed that the NHS apps library had real quality problems. So the majority of depression and anxiety apps that were accredited by the NHS apps library, which is now defunct, had no tangible evidence of outcomes to substantiate their claims. 85% of apps, we didn't really know whether they worked or not, whether they were any good or not. So what can we learn from that mistake, and how should we be evaluating the efficacy and the safety of apps? You know, safety is really important. So what are NICE doing at the moment to replace that? I wanted to ask James and Andreas, because I know you've both had some experience of what's going on at the moment. There's no sort of solution yet, but what can you tell us about what's going on in that field?
I'll let James just start. He's more of an expert.
Go on.
Go on, James.
I mean, I think. So I was actually just, as a bit of my homework, I was the Mind Tech speech from 2015 by Alexia Tonnell, who's from NICE, who's leading on this as a part of the National Information Board work stream, which I think is 1.2.
That's the one.
There's a nice video of her sort of explaining it on Mind Tech. So, I mean, the work is ongoing, and I think we're still learning. You know, and there is, so the sort of 4-stage app endorsement process, which looks at the sort of technical specification around data security and interoperability. Then there's the safety stuff, which is about the reliability of content, usability. It comes into stage 2, and then really it's about stage 3 and 4 are a sort of impact, which is where we get into building an evidence base and around effectiveness, cost saving. And I think there, you know, there's some discussion about how you do that, in terms of we can't really rely on RCTs to do that in the traditional way, certainly in the way that they're funded, and the fact that it takes 5 years to set them up, 10 years to run them, 13 years to publish them, and you know, by that time we'll be living in space. So there's something about that stage 3 and 4, which I think we need collaboration with academia, with research colleagues about, and with patients or users about what's the best way of gathering that evidence. So for me, the first 2 stages are probably the easiest ones to nail, you know, in terms of technical specificity, who the data is being shared with, where it's being stored, blah, blah, blah. I think it's stage 3 and 4 that are more tricky, and that work is ongoing. So there are going to be some projects coming out of NHS England that hopefully will allow us to test some of this out with a select group of digital products to take them through this endorsement process. And I think once we do that, we might get different iterations of the endorsement process. So I think that's where we're up to at the moment.
It sounds like sorry, James. It sounds like it's a lot simpler than the kind of traditional NHS accreditation approach, such as what we have with the information standard, for example. I'm thinking about, you know, the success or failure of these sorts of things tends to be whether they work from a developer perspective, whether developers are prepared to go through the hoops. So, Andreas, you've had some experience of kind of doing this from a developer perspective. What's your view on it now?
Yes. So, I mean, I think the National Information Board has published some of the results of their early engagement talks. We were part of some of that. Basically, I mean, from our point of view and from most people's point of view, this is a very positive move. I think they're being very from you know, we're in the receiving end of this, and it seems to be fairer than or more balanced than what was happening with the apps library before, which was a bit, you know, was a bit wrong. Didn't make a lot of sense. So we've been invited, for example, to one of their pilots to see whether their evaluation process works. So it's not that we're being evaluated; it's they're testing their own way of evaluating it. They're saying, you know, what's your experience of going through this process? So I thought that was extremely positive. That that was very welcome from a developer perspective. So from our point of view, obviously, we want safe apps to be safe, effective apps to be accessible. They also want the same. They don't want to discourage new people coming in and making it extremely onerous. It is a hard balance to strike, but they are making the right moves, I would say, from my perspective anyway.
I wanted to come back and just add a little bit, which I think Alexia's video, which I think Holly has tweeted into the discussion, is this idea of sort of what are we talking about here, and not to get too technical about it in terms of the taxonomy of what we're talking about. So I think we have to be clear, if we're trying to develop products to go into the NHS, are we developing digital services that require regulation just via the CQC? So we could look at the example of Big White Wall, which is, as far as I'm aware, regulated by the CQC as a digital service, versus a tool, maybe a standalone diary tool, maybe a standalone, anxiety or relaxation tool, which if you took all the people in the world away, apart from the person using it, it would still work and it would still help them. And I think that the danger is for developers is they're not quite sure which end of that spectrum they're on, or whether they're trying to do a bit of both. So I think if you're trying to sell to the NHS, you've got to be clear about what the NHS can buy. It can buy and commission services almost more easily than it can buy tools which don't have any governance structure around them, aren't very clear in terms of whose fault it might be if something goes wrong, whereas services generally have a much tighter governance structure that allows people to feel safe and confident in what they're buying.
Okay, thank you. I'm just conscious of time, and I do want to leave enough time to talk about the kind of key future challenges, but before we get on to that, there's something around evaluating, and James, you were talking about the lack of the fact that RCTs just really are a sledgehammer to crack a nut sometimes in this. They just take too long. But so are we just saying that we can't do RCTs in digital mental health, or are we saying that we need to have a new way of designing RCTs so that they work in this way, which is much more iterative and responsive to technologies which are changing over time? Lisa, you're a researcher and you're nodding, so I'm going to ask you to come in.
Because I think to some extent maybe we need to think about evaluating mechanisms, whether that's and processes, whether that's processes of blending the kind of therapy that James has been talking about. Can I, as a therapist, use what's available out there and integrate it into what I do in a meaningful way, and in a way that supports what I do, doesn't replace it, that actually helps with it. So maybe it's more about evaluating that and evaluating it in a sort of robust academic way than evaluating individual apps or individual products, because the risk is that, as you said, by the time there is an RCT showing that they are effective, they're outdated, and that I think that is an issue. And also, I wonder if it's an area of mental health whether we need to talk about evidence-informed practice more than evidence-based practice because of these various problems. There was a systematic review published about 2-3 years ago showing that out of the 3,000 or however many apps there were at the time for mental health, only 5 have evidence of effectiveness. And yes, there is an issue with more of these apps need to be developed with an evidence base, but it's partly because it just takes so long. If I started an RCT on our Insight app that I just showed, in the current, if it was an RCT, I'd be able to tell you in 5 years' time.
Yeah, sure.
Can I ask why that is? This seems really important about the time that it takes to do a rigorous evaluation. Because I'm not clear on whether you're saying that it's the RCT itself which takes ages, which normally takes, as I understand it, not much longer than the outcome that you're looking at to appear takes. or whether you're saying that getting all the pre and post stuff, like getting it through an ethics committee and then getting it published, whether it's all academic la-la that takes forever.
I think it's getting the funding in the first place. It's a slow process, and it's a difficult process in relation to sort of innovation, partly because you're in a sort of multidisciplinary context, and at least, if you're trying to get funding in a sort of standard academic research council sort of way, you end up, multidisciplinarity is great, but actually nobody's going to fund you because you're not quite what they fund. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of, the ways in which, the process works, again, at least in a sort of academic sense, is that you've got to say exactly what you're doing, what you're evaluating, what you're expecting to find, etc., etc. And it goes back to that, rapidly evolving technologies and interventions. So you might not necessarily know that. So I think a lot of it is about the processes that are around and what needs to be in place, both funding-wise, ethics-wise, and then, co-design. We all said, from the outset, is very important, but that takes a long time. By the time we've consulted, users, clinicians, developers, etc., it just takes time, I guess. So I wonder if it's more useful to think about evaluating the mechanisms and evaluating things like, do we prompt people, do we not? How safe is it to use? Should the data sharing be in real time or not? I know with our app, one of the concerns was, what's the kind of blurred boundary between research, monitoring and clinical intervention? Do you set systems in place so that somebody is able to sort of see in real time what the user is doing or saying?
If I can jump into discussion. Sorry.
Go.
Yeah. Sorry. Going back to what James and Lisa were saying, I'm an innocent bystander. I don't know anything about mHealth. I'm here to learn. But on the other hand, my daily job is mainly about systematic review and randomized controlled trials. And what I think it's really fascinating of this mHealth, even it's not the right word, as Andrea said, is that it's a completely innovative thing. So the framework of the randomized controlled trial, which is something we as clinicians tend to use to have unbiased evaluation, is probably an old design to assess new things like this digital health system. In my view, the big limitation, well, Lisa mentioned some of them, but the other one is the comparator. We are used to have this aseptic context of the placebo-controlled trial. Well, I can't understand, I can figure out which could be a reliable comparison. Why I think it's more exciting to use a completely different perspective, and why don't use an observational data, but very good, real patients, real people, and the developing issue can also be dealt with the adaptive design studies rather than the standard randomized thing. And the other argument, just some thoughts, the other argument against standard randomized controlled trial links to the ethics. When we do an application for a randomized controlled trial, and we have to deal with ethics quite extensively, I really don't know for mHealth which is the ethics framework. My feeling is that in these kind of things, ethics comes always after, while we might have time to think ahead which are the ethical implications of all this new system.
Thank you, Andrea. That's very interesting. I want to move on, Mark, but there's another point I want to cover before we finish. We've only got 5 minutes left. I just wanted to point out that the journal Digital Mental Health is evidence-based mental health rather has got a new section on digital mental health, which is launching soon. That Andrea and Lisa would be too embarrassed or wouldn't want to mention. So I'm going to mention that on their behalf. Lisa's leading on that. So I guess we'll see the studies that are being published in digital mental health. We'll see if there are RCTs or observational studies or what it is that's coming out that will be featuring in there and different sorts of designs. I wanted to move on to this kind of question about business models. I think this is really important that we cover this before the end. We've got 5 minutes. There was a fantastic digital mental health product, the award-winning the Buddy app product, which was the one that everyone used as an example with Big White Wall as really amazing and successful, that recently shut down because the company wasn't able to continue trading. And so there's a real challenge here that we have in this sector, that small businesses, develop an amazing product, they build up a bit of a set of clients, and they get some revenue coming in, and then getting over that to become a really successful, scalable product that can grow. What can we do to support these developers to do that more successfully?
In that instance, Andrea, where that company goes under, does the intellectual property all disappear as well? Is there any way to rescue any of that?
I mean, I don't know. Sorry, Mark.
I was just going to say the intellectual property has a value in itself, which presumably belongs to the people who own it. This is the interesting thing about sort of digital development, in that it's very easy to talk about it like it's a vast, great commons, and we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and we're all collegiate. But knowledge and experience, and research and implementation has a value. And to be honest, with the NHS is actually really bad at investing in this kind of knowledge. So it can't really complain if that knowledge, someone just goes, actually, I'm just going to stick it in my back pocket. My business has gone bust. That's it. So this, I'm off and doing something else. If the NHS were to become a kind of prime investor in these things, it would have a bit more of a say about what would happen. Not a customer, but an investor. And I think that's an interesting difference. The NHS loves to be a customer in this. The UK government loves to be a customer in this, but it doesn't necessarily want to be an investor. And I think actually the only way we can bridge the problem of the fact that it's incredibly hard to sustain a business selling to the NHS, unless you're massive already, is that the NHS begins to invest more seriously in this sort of stuff. That would be my view.
Why does the investment have to come from the NHS rather than anywhere else?
Because the NHS is the prime market for it in the UK. Most investors look at this and they say, well, there's only a finite number of mental health trusts and a finite number of CCGs in this country. Even if you manage to sell to all of those, that doesn't mean we would need to put in to get you to the point of having sold to all of those. That's why people tend to try and do this stuff in other countries with other systems.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I'll just come in for a bit. So, for example, our own business model does not include at all selling to the NHS. If you look at what we do in this country, sometimes we encounter a barrier where there is a potential client that wants to engage us in some way. So we're mostly business to business rather than business to consumer. Although it is available business to consumer, but our main strategy is business to business. So the problem that we have sometimes when we speak to some institutions is that they say, well, the NHS should be funding this, so we need it. We obviously would be able to use it, but because somebody else should be paying for it, we're not going to buy it until they buy it. So it warps the market in a very interesting way. When you're talking to UK clients, sometimes I just wanted to make that point. So even if you're not trying to sell the NHS, the presence of the NHS disrupts because people's expectations is that health should pay for this. We do have the problem, but we've been told that health should be taking care of these issues, so they should pay for it, not us.
Okay.
So.
James, would you like to shed any light on what NHS England thinks about all of it?
I think this is something that's still being worked through, and I think we're still learning how to do this stuff. And I think that's if you look at a number of projects that are going on. So you look at the testbed programs going on at the moment in a variety of sites. You look at the digital elements of the vanguards. I think the NHS is still trying to work out. The NHS and England particularly is still trying to work out how to integrate these technologies and the way that they are commissioned into services. And I think it'll be interesting to see what learning comes out of the testbed programs, and particularly I think I'm pretty excited about the Birmingham program in looking at liaison and the kind of use of technology to predict presentation to services, using digital apps to help people cope in crisis. I think that blended technology approach, so not just thinking, unfortunately, about Buddy app being bolted onto an existing service, but really taking Buddy as an integral part of how you design a service. And I think that has to be the approach that we go with, rather than trying to, like I say, it may be that Buddy was either too early in getting into the marketplace, in that people weren't quite ready to build services around it, so it just became bolted on. So therefore, clinicians thought, well, it was bolted on, so we can bolt it off again, as it were. And it may be that, you know, something like Buddy or a product like that actually.
Oh.
No.
Oh no.
Okay, that's really a nice place to stop, isn't it? Just as he was about to give us a golden nugget of knowledge, it looks like we've lost our connection with James. So that's proof that people who connect from NHS networks really are the bane of these hangouts. We're out of time, so that's a really frustrating moment to leave it on, but I think I'm going to wind up now. And say thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's been a really interesting discussion. It could have gone on for a lot longer, I'm sure. So thanks very much to everyone for joining us. Thanks to the people that have watched. I'm going to go straight to Twitter now and send some EBMH chat tweets. So please do the same. I'm sure this will carry on for the rest of the afternoon. And we'll see you soon with another EBMH chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.